All right, looks like we are live. How's everybody doing tonight? Welcome to another episode of Sasquatch Out of the Shadows Live. I'm your host, Alex Pedikov, as always. I hope everyone's having a good Monday night so far. It's my favorite way to break up the mundaneness that often is Monday. So, as always, guys, if you've seen some of the previous episodes, or if you haven't, you can go back and rewatch them all. There's a playlist right on the channel. This is the 31st stream so far. So we're getting up there in the 30s here with Sasquatch Out of the Shadows Live, which is really awesome. Last week, we had a really interesting show with Craig Woolheater of the Texas Bigfoot Conference and of Cryptomundo, and he's a Texas Bigfoot researcher and in the South. So really interesting stuff if you want to check that out. Next week, we're going to be talking to Doug Hajicek, who is the producer of the show MonsterQuest, which is really awesome. That's a show that I enjoyed seeing a lot when I was younger. He also was a producer, I believe, on Sasquatch Legend Meets Science, which was with Jeff Meldrum. So it was really interesting. He's done a lot of great cryptid programs. We're really excited to talk to him. But tonight, we're actually going to be joined by somebody that was on MonsterQuest. So tonight, I'm joined by Scott Mardis. Scott is a lifelong researcher of aquatic cryptids, primarily as one of the foremost researchers of the Lake Champlain monster of Lake Champlain, Vermont, in New York. Those of you that have seen the show before probably know Champ is one of my favorite cryptids. We did a recap episode with Chasing Legends recently about our trip to Lake Champlain, so it's going to be awesome to talk to Scott about that. But Scott has researched Champ since the 1990s. He lived in the area for a while. He also has an interest in other lake monsters and aquatic cryptids like the Loch Ness Monster, the Altamahaha. We'll talk about some of that stuff. He's written some papers on the topic as well. He's looked into some of the Florida sea monsters and lake monsters, and I understand he's researched a little bit of that as well, as he lives in Florida now. So that'll be pretty awesome to talk to him. So without further ado, let's get Scott Mardis in here. How you doing, Scott?
Hello, Alex. Good to see you.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, man.
Yeah.
So as I just read through your bio, awesome. You've done a lot of lake monster research. Obviously, we've worked together. I interviewed you in 2017 for my documentary series on the Trail of Champ when you were still working with Bill Dranginis.
Yeah.
We also have done some work kind of on the side, and now we're, I guess, in the Lake Champlain zoological inquiry as well. So
Yep.
let's start out with the basics. Do you want to talk a little bit about what got you interested in cryptozoology or lake cryptids, aquatic cryptids? Where did the interest start?
Well, when I was a kid, I was crazy about dinosaurs. And then probably somewhere around 1969, 70, 71, I heard about the Loch Ness Monster. And of course, I read all the newspaper articles, and you know, normally they would say, oh, it's probably a living dinosaur. And actually, what they meant was a plesiosaur, which is not a dinosaur, but in the popular sense, it is.
Right.
So that really put the hook in me, and I followed it. And I remember when the Rhines underwater flipper pictures came out in the early 70s. And I remember when the 1975 pictures were all over the newspapers. And around the same time, I saw Jaws when I was 11 years old.
Nice.
So it was like, you know, another major thing too. I don't know if you ever seen this. It's from 1974. National Geographic did a special about Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster and the Yeti, with Rod Serling was the host.
Oh, cool.
And that was, yeah, you can't imagine how cool it is. If you've never seen it, it's on YouTube. You should definitely go dig it up. But that had a very big impact on me too. I didn't really get serious about it until, say, early 90s. And I wound up doing volunteer work in the Philadelphia Academy of Natural Sciences in the paleontology department. Learned a lot there. Made my initial trip to Lake Champlain when I was still living in Philly in November of 1992. Eventually moved to Burlington, Vermont in April of 1994 and stayed till almost January 2012, which is roughly 18 years.
Nice. That's awesome.
Yeah, so, and I've been going back every year to Lake Champlain since 2013. So you can say that the only year between 1994 and now that I have not been at Lake Champlain was 2012. And unfortunately, that was the year that Jeremy Wade showed up. So,
oh yeah,
these things happen.
Right. Now, what was there anything about Champ in particular that particular lake monster interested you over others, or was it just, what was the kind of behind that?
It was conveniently located. I couldn't pick up and move to Scotland very easily, but moving from Pennsylvania to Vermont was doable.
Right.
And I was very impressed by Sam Manzi's photograph. And, I thought, well, this is not Loch Ness, but it's a good consolation prize. And I haven't been disappointed. If anything, my excitement about the potential of Lake Champlain has only grown over the years, in part due to things that I've found in my own investigations.
Right.
Such as the sonar blob that happened while you were making your documentary. That's in the documentary.
Right.
And 2016, we had, when the Japanese, Asai Broadcasting were there, had some kind of appendage come up and touch a piece of bait on camera underwater. We still don't know what that was, but that's interesting.
Yeah, I've seen that. You've posted that before. Do you have a rough idea of like a size estimate of what that object was?
Well,
the size of it?
I held that piece of salmon in my hand before it was put on the hook. It was the size of my hand, so I'm guessing 2 feet, something like that for the appendage.
Interesting.
It's about twice the size of the bait, so it could have been the tail or a big fin or a flipper of something.
Right.
So, it could be, it looks like the tail of an eel. It could have been a big eel. I've got the opinion of one fishing guide that I know that works in the lake, and he said it might be a bowfin, a really big bowfin.
Bowfins, yeah.
And the reason he said he thought it might be a bowfin is he said when they attack something, they like to curl up their body. Kind of, go into an arch. And that's what made him think it was a bowfin.
Right.
And then I had someone else give me the opinion. They said it looked like a seal's head. I don't think it's a head because I don't see any features on there that look like eyes or a mouth. I think it's a tail or an appendage of some sort.
Right.
But it could be part of a larger animal that we don't see on the image. And it looks kind of like a flipper, so I don't know.
Do you know which part of the lake this was in?
Yeah, it was over at Split Rock. At the deepest part of the lake, 400 feet deep. And the camera was down below the boat that I was in, 80 feet below the boat. So I was in a boat up above this while it was happening. We didn't have this rigged up to watch live what was happening on the video. We could only see this after the cameras were brought up and the videos were staged to see if anything was on them. The camera was down on a fishing downrigger with a light source and the bait on a hook.
This was this at night, or what time of day was this?
No, this was during the day, probably I think around 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
Right, because I know in the video it's a little dark, but once you're down at that level, there's not much ambient light, correct?
Yeah, the only light there is the light that was on rigged to the camera. So
interesting.
Yeah, so
interesting. So before we go any further, let's just take this back one step. Let's say there's somebody watching this program who has not ever heard of the Lake Champlain monster. Do you want to tell a little bit about what it is and what your theory is, and maybe some of
the you've had a steady stream of reports of unusual observations of something along the lines of a giant snake or a dinosaur that has been seen sporadically. You got a regular series of reports stretching from 1873 up into the modern era. Sometimes years go by and you don't get a report, but I would say that the official beginning of the modern champ reports began in 1873 in Dresden, New York. But in addition to that, you've got the natives that live around the lake, have a tradition of some kind of creature, serpent-like creature in the lake, and that's different tribes on both sides of the lake, different cultures, have the same legend. They have different names for it, but it is generally believed that probably the serpent of their legends is the same thing as people are seeing in these modern reports. So you've got photographic evidence, you've got recordings of unidentified sounds that may be coming from an animal. That may be evidence for these animals. You've got photographs, unexplained sonar contacts, very similar to the situation you have at Loch Ness, but with the added dimension of the sound evidence. And some of the photographic evidence and a great majority of the really good sighting reports seem to be describing something along the lines of a long-necked plesiosaur. Now, there's some debate about that. Some people think it could be something more along the lines of one of these elongated snake-like whales like Basilosaurus, which is not impossible. But the general image that pops up is very similar to what people think the Loch Ness Monster looks like, this animal with a large body, probably flippers, and a long neck and a snake-like head and maybe a long tail. So that basically matches up with the long-necked plesiosaurs of the Mesozoic era, which are believed to have been extinct for 66 million years, but had a known fossil record of 140 million years, roughly contemporaneous with the dinosaurs. They were highly successful animals and are thought to have died out during this same extinction, the Cretaceous Tertiary extinction that wiped out the dinosaurs and the flying reptiles and the rest of the marine reptiles. So in order to make that idea work, a lot of people point to the rediscovery of the living coelacanth in 1938. This was an animal that was supposed to have gone extinct at the same time period roughly, was rediscovered alive. So the idea is that it's just possible that we could have had some long-necked plesiosaurs that managed to survive out in the deep ocean that we don't know about. We know that places like Loch Ness and Lake Champlain were once arms of the sea at the end of the last ice age. All this ice melted, raised sea levels, and these places were invaded by marine waters. We know there were seals and whales and things like that you normally find in the ocean living in these places. Right. Then the land rose and cut off these places from the sea. So the idea is that it's possible that some plesiosaurs that we don't know about came in from the deep ocean, came into Loch Ness, Lake Champlain, and got trapped. And there's been a small colony of them living in there, living and dying ever since. That's the simplest explanation, just taking the eyewitness reports and the photographic evidence at face value.
Right.
Now, it depends on how much faith you have in eyewitness testimony evidence and the available evidence that we have now. You know, it's a crazy case, but it's a case. So.
Oh, absolutely. And before we go any further, I just want to say you're an absolute treasure trove of knowledge on that, particularly the champ subject, but other ones as well. You know, when I was doing my On the Trail of Champ series, I could ask you about all sorts of stuff, and you would send me a PDF or a scientific paper over or something you've written about the subject, or, oh, this is a sighting that happened in 1960s in Alberg or wherever. Really interesting, and, you know, other than just On the Trail of Champ, other series as well, and, you know, recently Chasing Legends. And
to me, it's like, you know, just looking at the case from Lake Champlain might not be that impressive, but if you add the evidence from Loch Ness and from the ocean and from some other places, it makes the case better. You've got more evidence to work with. And if you're working from the idea that, okay, these are small colonies of animals that originally lived in the ocean, then it's putting together the bigger picture.
Interesting. Now, let me ask you, I would say that you probably consider Champ to be maybe one of your biggest pursuits in this aquatic cryptid field.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say, let's say top 5, I know this is going to be a tough one, but top 5 pieces of evidence for Champ, what would you point to, or what would you hold up as examples? If not exactly evidence that it's proof, but some of the best stuff that's out there, because I know obviously there's a bunch.
The 3 that I come back to always are Sandra Manzi's photograph,
yep,
Peter Burdett and Richard Falter's video, Eric Olson's video from 2009, let's say Liz von Muggenthaler's 2003 audio recordings of some kind of sound, which is probably an animal. I mean, unless somebody comes up with a better answer, I'm assuming it's an animal.
Right.
And then, not to purposely bring myself into this, but I think that the sonar contact that me and Will got in 2017 is pretty impressive.
Yeah, definitely. And
it's along the lines of these recent really good sonar contacts that have been coming out of Loch Ness the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, that's also been really interesting.
Yeah.
I do want to talk just about the sonar contact for a minute. So 2017, you guys were out there. Do you want to describe what was going on, when you got the sonar contact and what your initial reaction was?
Yeah, well, this whole thing started out, this is on July 4th of all days. We were trying to figure out the easiest way to get over to the Burdett site. Now, we could have drove with a boat trailer all the way around the rim of the lake and went over to New York State and went down that way. But I got with Will and I said, look, if we leave from Colchester Marina, go through the causeway, and you recently made this same trip.
Yeah, we did.
Go through the causeway and then go straight across the lake. You're at the mouth of the Alsable River. So that's what we did. We parked his truck and the boat trailer in Colchester at the marina and left it overnight and drove the boat all the way. It was a real pain in the butt, but we did it all the way across the lake through the causeway to the mouth of the Alsable River. And we got there, I don't know, 3:30 in the afternoon, 4:30. The sun was starting to go down. I mean, it wasn't really down, but it was setting down low in the sky. You could tell that probably in about 2 hours the sun was going to go down.
Right.
So we're sitting there, and I happened to look at the sonar screen, and here's this blob. And I was like, get over here, turn this thing on right now. And he's like, oh, I forgot to put the SD card in. So I'm like, oh, crap, So what we're going to do? So he grabs his cell phone and starts taking snaps of the screen. And at the same time that he's doing this, he's changing the settings to get, there's different settings you can set to get, a top view of the object or a side view of the object. So we've got several photographs that he shot of the screen of this thing, and it swam underneath the boat for about 2 minutes. You can see the time signatures on the photographs.
Right, and it was moving along, and
yeah. So it's moving underneath the boat, moving from left to right, and we're in 48 feet of water near those buoys that they believe that Falter and Burdett were at when they filmed the monster encounter. And the thing is underneath the boat, I believe it's like 12 feet off the bottom. And using the measurements that go up and down from the side and flipping that sideways, I estimated that it was probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 to 13 feet long. Maybe 10
okay.
feet long, at least 10 feet long, maybe 13 feet long, but in that size range.
Which at that size, it would be, if it was some sort of a fish, it would be on the larger side, correct?
Yeah, it would have to be a sturgeon. That's the only fish that gets that big, unless Atlantic sturgeon swam down the Richelieu River and got in somehow, which is not impossible. They can get 14 to 16 feet long.
And they found some in the Hudson River that have been, monstrous size.
Yeah. Well, one could theoretically get in from the Hudson River too, but they'd have to go through the Champlain Canal, which is difficult.
Right. Now, I've seen the sonar picture, obviously, that you're talking about, and it's really interesting because it shows like a blob and almost what looks like some sort of appendage protruding. Now, do you have any idea what, we're looking at? How were you able to determine if it was actually, an animate object? Were you able to do that?
Oh, no, unfortunately. But it was moving. We watched it for 2 minutes as it moved underneath the boat. It could have been wood debris. It could have been a fish. We don't know. But whatever it was, you can look at the screen and see that it's Nessie Champ plesiosaur shaped roughly in outline. Yeah. I don't know why you don't see a tail or why you don't see flippers. It's possible that there could have been flippers moving against the sides of that fat body.
Do you think the movement of sonar might not pick something up if it was moving quickly?
That's possible too, yeah. I've compared it with, I found some similar sonar readings of a sea turtle. And looking at it from the side, you can't see the flippers.
Interesting.
There's what is called an acoustic shadow on the image that shows the shadow of the sea turtle down on the bottom, and you can see the flippers on that shadow.
Okay.
I don't know why we didn't get an acoustic shadow on our sonar contact, but for whatever reason we didn't. Maybe it was because the sun wasn't out enough. I just don't know, or but for some reason we didn't.
Right.
But I will say this. The shape of the object in the sonar contact is very similar to the object that I saw in 1994 in my supposed, whatever you want to call it, champ sighting, which I believe was an animal, was roughly shaped the same way. And the object that you see in Eric Olson's video from Oak Ridge Park is shaped very similar too. So you can take all three of those images and put them side by side and see the similarity.
Oh, and I'd love for you to talk about your sighting. I do just want to mention one thing. As you mentioned, recently I was there. When we were there with Chasing Legends, we went from Mallett's Bay through Colchester, through the Causeway, and that is pretty much across from where the mouth of the Ausable River is, which is where the Bodette film was supposedly taken. Well, that's where the guy we were with, he's a scuba diver in the area, pretty well known around Lake Champlain, been diving the lake for years. He said that as of this past summer, around that same area, halfway between the Colchester Causeway and the mouth of the Ausable River, he saw this, what he could only describe as a 4 to 5 foot long back of what resembled a turtle that sunk into the water. He said, he'd never really believed in the champ stories, but now he was in the category of wondering, well, maybe there's something. And he also mentioned seeing sonar readings every few years. They would see a huge reading that would be definitely moving, and then it would just kind of disappear. It wasn't stationary, because they'd be out there looking for shipwrecked objects and other shipwrecks, because that's what a lot of the scuba divers do. So pretty interesting. But let's talk about, while you lived in Vermont, obviously you said in the 1990s you had seen something. Do you want to talk about that sighting?
Yes. A couple of months after I moved to Burlington, I was at Battery Park in Burlington, which overlooks the lake, which is near the boathouse in Burlington, if you've ever been over there. So anyway, this park sits up on a bluff. And I was watching the lake with binoculars. This was July of 1994. And right out in front of Battery Park is a small rock island called Rock Dunder. You may have seen pictures of it.
Yeah.
Very small rock island. Okay, to the right, or no, to the left of Rock Dunder, there are a series of buoys marking a shipwreck of a barge called the Noise. This is a place called Proctor Shoal. It's about 70 feet deep. Anyway, I happened to look out to one of these buoys and I saw this big object come up. Round, hump-like object with a smaller object on top of the crest of the mound. Then this whole thing turned to the right, and the smaller object was on the right end of the bigger object and looked like either a head on a short neck or a flipper. I'm inclined to think that this was an animal swimming on its side with its flipper up in the air, trying to thermoregulate. It was a garbage bag color, a greeny black, very much like the color of a leatherback sea turtle, but without the spots. A greenish black color. So this object sort of bobbed along for a few seconds, swam to the right, and then stopped and then sank like a rocket and was over. So I can't tell you exactly the time that this took, but it was very short, maybe 10, 15 seconds, but I was watching this whole thing through binoculars. So I had a really good view of it while it was there.
Right.
Yeah. So you could tell it was big. I waited for some boats to come by about the same size so I could use that to scale it with. Boats that came by in the same area. Then I went from where I was at down a couple of blocks to Perkins Pier. I was looking for boats similar to the one I saw that was the same size as this creature. Found one and estimated it to be about 15 feet long. So based on that, I think this object was about 15 feet long, the visible portion above the water. Later that same evening, I went home and drew sketches. Boy, it was still fresh in my mind. I think you've seen those.
Yeah, I've included them in the documentary with the interview. Really glad you did that because that's it's still fresh in your mind.
Yeah, I mean that's happened the very day it happened, and you can see those on the original news broadcast that happened a couple of days after it happened. About 3 days after, they had me on the news to interview me, and I showed the same sketches. So,
yeah, it's just interesting to hear that, and obviously I'm sure that got you a little more enthusiastic about the subject. Absolutely. Perhaps. Yeah, so why don't we start taking some questions? I know there's some questions coming in the audience. Let's see what we got here. So Stefan asks, question for Scott. There are many different theories concerning the lineage of Champ. What do you think about the claims that the creature of Lake Champlain is a species of plesiosaur, Elasmosaurus, ?
Well, that's the theory that I'm inclined to believe is most probably the origin of these animals. Besides that, I've heard a lot of people speculate it could be some kind of a turtle we don't know about. That's possible too.
Interesting. That's one of the other questions is going to be pertaining to that. Yeah.
Yeah. But to me, the two major problems with the turtle idea is that all the known turtles that we know about have anatomical constraints that prevented them during the course of their evolution from developing live birth, like all the other marine reptiles. We know that Mosasaurus gave live birth, Plesiosaurus gave live birth.
Interesting.
Ichthyosaurus gave live birth. They're thinking now that even these marine flippered crocodiles from that period gave live birth.
Wow.
For some reason, turtles, including the sea turtles, are still tied to the land. And that's one reason you see the difference between a sea turtle's fully blown front flippers, which are used to propel the animal through the water, And you look at the back legs, and they're different. They still got toes on them. And that's the reason why, is because they use their back feet to help push up onto the land to lay their eggs. And the answer to the reason why this is for whatever reason, the development of turtle fetuses in the egg, for some reason, the eggs aren't activated until they are laid. The fetus doesn't start really developing until the eggs are laid. For whatever reason, it's something to do with the way the turtles are built. The eggs can't get enough oxygen inside the mother. So the beginning of the development of the turtle, due to the lack of oxygen inside the mother, is delayed until the eggs are physically laid outside the mother's body. I don't know the mechanism, but that's the explanation as to why they did not develop live birth. Now, obviously, the question here is, you got a bunch of giant turtles living in Lake Champlain that we don't know about. They have to come ashore to lay eggs. They're going to have a hard time hiding.
Yeah.
Whereas if you have an animal like a plesiosaur that gives live birth in the water and doesn't come ashore to lay eggs, has a better chance of staying hidden. That's argument one. The other argument is that you go through the sightings history from Loch Ness and from Lake Champlain, and there's so many accounts of the back changing shape. There's even accounts of people watching the back changing shape into multiple humps, or humps consolidating into one hump, happening before their very eyes. Now, the way turtles evolved, their special body plan, is that the turtle's ribs encircled their limb girdles, their shoulders, and their pelvis. And what you see as a shell is actually their ribs that have grown outside around the body and created a box. So if you could imagine, if your ribs extended out around your shoulders and your pelvis, and then other pieces of bone were added to that to create a box to where you could draw your arms and legs inside the box, and your neck and all that. That's how the turtle shell evolved. Now, one of the prices of having that body plan is you lose any spinal flexibility whatsoever. And this is even in the case of the leatherback, which doesn't really have a turtle shell, but it still has the same framework of ribs.
Interesting.
Like a turtle shell. So basically what I'm saying is that there is no spinal flexibility whatsoever in any kind of turtle species.
Right.
Which would seem to rule out this ability to change the shape of the back.
Yeah, so one of the questions that was asked was with Mike. My buddy Mike says, does Scott think it might be a turtle? Now, what's interesting is he has a friend. He's a former diver, I think with state of New York police. If I'm not mistaken, Mike, you correct me, but I'm pretty sure that's what he used to do. But he has a friend who I was in contact with a while ago who is a biologist, if I'm not mistaken, I sent him a video of the Olsen video because, and he just asking if he thinks that might be a turtle. I think his answer was it was not a turtle. But Mike also did ask in another question, if I can find it, he said, hasn't Champ been seen on land? Now, do you know anything about the land sightings?
Absolutely. I would say roughly there are 4 or 5 that I'm familiar with that are fairly well documented. You know Joe Citro.
Yes, of course.
All right. Well, Joe Citro, he's never revealed the name of this guy, and I don't blame the guy, wants to remain anonymous. But this guy's father was a doctor and was driving down a causeway one night and saw some kind of reptilian animal cross the road in front of his car. Now, this is the same encounter has been described in old magazine articles, but in all the cases there's no name attached to it, but just that a Burlington doctor, whoever that guy is. But Joe Citro knows the son of this doctor. So I'm willing to give it credence. And there was a guy who was over in Westport in 1961. He's in Joe Zarzinski's book. A guy
yes, that's right. With
Thomas Morris, yeah, was riding in his car around the rim of the lake around Westport and looked out his car and saw this thing sitting halfway out on the beach. He said it had a long, either neck or body, had an ear-like head with teeth that raked rearward in the mouth, and that the rest of the body was out into the water. So what I picture in my head is either some kind of a giant eel-looking creature sitting halfway up on the beach with the front end of its body sitting up on the beach and the rest of it down in the water, or some kind of plesiosaurus-like creature with its body in the water and a long snake-looking neck laying up on the beach. This happened in 1961. Then the most recent one I'm aware of was 1991, was documented by Dennis Hall. This guy named Todd Hustis, somewhere around Ferrisburg, was riding on an ATV and almost ran over this thing as it was crossing the road to go back into the water. A reptilian creature that was at least 15 feet long because it described this long tail. So that's 3 right there. There are more, but I just have to go dig for them.
Sure. Would you consider the sightings there at the Our Family Boathouse as on land? I know technically the creatures are kind of in the water. What are your thoughts on that?
Almost. I've known Charlie and Christine for a quarter of a century, and I've spoken to them about it many times. And their theory was, the boathouse is right there at the mouth of the Winooski River. They said that at the time these sightings happened, the water level was very low, kind of like what it is right now. And Christine had the idea that normally they would swim up the river, but maybe they were confused. Oh, I'm sorry. The water level was high instead of being low. And she thinks that that's what confused these creatures. They were trying to get into the river mouth, and because the water level was high, they came in next to the boat ramp confused. And she had more than one sighting, 3 weeks apart, saw 2 different individual animals. One was a brown animal that she described as having a long neck, standing up out of the water, resembling a brontosaurus or a plesiosaur, probably about 8 feet high, and she could see a hump behind it. The second time, apparently, she saw a somewhat smaller animal that was a greenish color, but was in the same configuration. Now, so this was right next to, you've been down there, you've seen it, the light right next to the boat ramp.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if the boat ramp goes, the water level up, the water would be right there.
Yeah, so it was basically right underneath that light.
Yeah.
She had a good view of it. She was up looking out the window at the boathouse. Charlie almost saw the same thing. She called him the second time it happened.
Right.
He got there in time to see he described it as seeing a pole-like object going out into the darkness, swimming away. So evidently the implication is that he come in on the tail end as the animal was swimming away that second time. But the first time she saw it, she claimed her mother was there too.
Yeah, I remember she mentioned that. So we actually interviewed her. We interviewed Christine Hebert just right at the spot in September when we were there. And it was my first time actually interviewing her. I'd seen her on MonsterQuest and some other programs. I know you talked about her when when we were there together in 2017,
Yep.
we interviewed obviously Charlie, so her brother, and he talked about what he experienced, and then I asked him about some of the other stuff. Had other people over the years seen stuff, and he told of some pretty interesting stories, and I think that one's just really particularly fascinating.
There's one that happened in like 1951, where this couple rented a rowboat from them at the boathouse and went out and then abruptly came back very quickly and wouldn't explain what happened. Later on, Charlie saw him again, and the guy said they saw this Champlain monster come up next to the rowboat, and it scared them.
I think the dog was even frothing at the
there was a dog involved too, yeah. I can't remember the guy's name, but somewhere I have the original newspaper article from the Burlington Free Press.
Wow.
From 1951 or 52 about the incident.
Interesting.
Yeah, so, there's independent confirmation that something happened.
It is really quite something, all these champ stories.
You could say that what happened at the boathouse was almost an amphibious sighting because it was in very, very shallow water. Christine said she couldn't see any kind of appendages, but it had to be sitting there almost on its belly.
Right.
We're correct about its anatomical configuration,
Yeah, when we were there just in September, so as you mentioned earlier, the water levels in the lake are very low this year, extremely low. I mean, we could walk out probably like half a mile right as the water was getting sort of, the sand was turning kind of wet.
I'm worried about that situation. I'm afraid that if climate change doesn't change and we don't get a lot of snow or there's not something to bring the water level back up, we may be witnessing the slow death of Lake Champlain.
Yeah, which is another issue unto itself. Obviously, the lake has been suffering a lot with pollution and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, the sewage dumps. And I was there in 2011 when Hurricane Irene came through, and that did a lot of damage. It gummed up the rivers.
Yep.
And, the water right there in front of the boathouse at Charlie's and in the river there is a mess because so much sediment got washed into the river and is clogging the river flow.
Yeah, I know even the Colchester Causeway, that's been torn up many times, but it's taken a lot of damage because it's literally a bike path that is surrounded by water on either side and it goes for, I think, almost 4 or 5 miles.
Well, there's a ferry connected with that. There's one place where you have to get off the bike trail and take a ferry to connect to the other side of it. I think at Grand Isle, one of them places. But
it's just wide enough for boats to get through. But other than that, if you guys look at it on a map, it's an amazing spot. It really is.
I mean, the bike trail goes from somewhere in Burlington, I think, all the way up into the islands.
I think it passes by our family boathouse. That,
it's right behind. Yep.
Yeah, you can go pretty much from downtown Burlington to I think South Hero would be the island there. That bridge right there next to the boathouse, that's part of it. Yeah, that's where I interviewed you about your sighting there in 2017. Awesome. So let's switch up a little bit here because we got a question from Uncle Junior, and I gotta say, I saw he'd posted a comment. He's got Uncle Junior from The Sopranos. I'm a huge Sopranos fan, so.
Oh, me too.
Yeah, so I hope this is the real Uncle
Corrado Soprano.
Corrado Soprano. Good to see you're alive and well, my friend. We're glad to see you around. But Uncle Junior asks, what about the creature in Lake Okanagan? So Ogopogo. Do you know anything you know about that a little bit?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I was interviewing Lee Murphy, if you know who he is, last night for The Haunted Sea, which is coming out on Thanksgiving, and we were talking about this very subject. Now, extending the Ogopogo to Cadburysaurus Wilseye, you've got the carcass pulled out of the bed of a sperm whale in 1937 of something that looks like a sea serpent or possibly an emaciated Basilosaurus. Now, Ed Bousfield, who was the co-author of the paper on that carcass with Paula Blind, published a later paper expressing the idea that he thought that the Ogopogo creatures were landlocked freshwater adapted Cadburysaurus creatures that had swam up the Columbia River and got trapped in Lake Okanagan. And based on the eyewitness testimony descriptions of both creatures, I tend to agree with it. So I think that whatever the Ogopogo is a freshwater version of whatever Cadburysaurus willseye is. And I'm talking about, there's a whole bunch of mixed up things that are seen off Vancouver that are obviously describing different things, but there's a subset of them that look like that carcass. So I think that whatever that carcass was, if it was a legitimate unknown animal, and I'm inclined to think it was, some people have expressed the idea that it might have been a mutilated basking shark or a mutilated white sturgeon, but the head is so well formed with features like a mouth and eyes and maybe even nostrils. I don't think it's a mutilated carcass of anything. I think it's some kind of a weird animal we don't know about yet. Whatever that thing is, I believe is most likely what the Ogopogo is.
Yeah, and that would be different than, the descriptions of Champ.
Yeah, it's obviously not some kind of a plesiosaurus creature. It's something more along the lines of a weird eel or something like Basilosaurus. It seems to have a very similar morphology to Basilosaurus. So, I don't know.
Yeah, that's another one. I've always wanted to look into that. I like some of these quirkier ones, like Ogopogo or Cadburysaurus, Ultima Haha. A lot of these ones that are really interesting. Now, there's one I want to ask you about, the Pensacola one. We'll talk about that soon, but let's take this question from Carrick, who is obviously our fellow...
I think I know this guy.
Yeah, he's obviously... So Carrick is working on his own documentary called Release the Baudette Film, about the Champ Baudette film, and he interviewed you and worked with you as well at the lake in August, this past August. Carrick's a good friend. He's been on the show before. He's also a member of the Lake Champlain Zoological Inquiry with us. His question is, what does Scott think is the best evidence overall for surviving plesiosaurs?
Well, let's see. Let's start with the Valhalla sea serpent sighting of 1905. Two English naturalists were on a research cruise off the coast of Brazil and saw an unknown animal, made sketches of it, and published a report about it in the Proceedings of the Zoological Society of London for 1906. And essentially what they have described was something that looked like a long-necked plesiosaur with a rectangular dorsal fin on its back. And this remains unexplained to this day, and has always been, for many years, the cornerstone of one of my beliefs that there might be something along the lines of a plesiosaur, at least something that looks like one, surviving in the ocean. Then, there's another case. This was originally came to people's attention in a book by Charles Berlitz in 1977 called Without a Trace. He tracked down Marvin McCamus, who was one of the pilots for the Alvin submersible used by the Navy to investigate shipwrecks and sonar arrays and all sorts of things. So there's no disputing that McCamus was a pilot for the Navy for the Alvin submersible.
Yeah.
So in Berlitz's book, McCamus claimed to have been investigating a sonar array for the Navy that they used to monitor for enemy submarines in a place called the Tongue of the Ocean in the Bahamas. According to McCamus's testimony, they saw something that looked like a swimming utility pole. When they got up closer to it, they saw some creature that looked like a long-necked plesiosaur with a large body, a long neck, and flippers. They saw it for a few seconds and then it swam away, and they tracked it on sonar. Now, when this came out in Berlitz's book, a lot of people said, well, this can't be true. This is too hard to believe. He must have made this up out of whole cloth. Right? So sometime around 1995, 96, I decided to make an honest effort to look into this. So there used to be a thing on Yahoo, a search thing called Yahoo People. And you could look up people by their phone number on this search engine.
Interesting, yeah.
So I punched in the name Marvin McCamus and came up with 3 hits and called each one of them. And I said, are you Marvin McCamus, who used to be the pilot for the Alvin Submersible? 2 of them weren't, but the 3rd one that lived in Port St. Lucie, Florida was.
Ah.
Now, I imagine he was probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 years old when I got a hold of it. And I said, well, look, I told him who I was, and I says, look, I'm trying to find out if this story that was in the Charles Berlitz book about you seeing a sea monster was real or not. And he says, yes, it really happened.
Wow.
But the kicker here is Berlitz got the year wrong. In 1969 was the year that Berlitz gave for this to have happened. And the thing is, in 1969, the Alvin was in dry dock. It had sank and was being repaired. So it could have happened in 1969. But McCamus told me it happened in 1965. But that basically what was written in Berlitz's book was accurate, except for the year. And he said, I asked him, well, did it look like a long-necked plesiosaur? And he said, yes. So what happened was, after this initial phone call, I went and photocopied all the Bob Rhines Loch Ness photographs and articles, the scientific papers about the Zia Maru carcass, various artist illustrations of long-necked plesiosaurs from paleontology books, and put together a big package and sent it in a manila envelope to McCamus, and then called him back later, and he says, yep, that's what it looked like.
Wow.
So that really happened.
That is really quite a...
Yeah. And unfortunately, I put him in contact with J. Richard Greenwell, who was the secretary of the International Society of Cryptozoology. Greenwell made a trip to Florida and looked him up and videotaped an interview with him.
Awesome.
But then McCamus died in 2004. Greenwell died of cancer in 2005.
Oh, yeah.
So this is all lost except for the documentation I have. The only material evidence I have to back this up, McCamus sent me a Christmas card. I have the original Christmas card that McCamus sent me, and the signature on the Christmas card matches samples of McCamus's signatures on articles.
Right.
Yeah, so
that's unfortunate circumstance, but you really did some due diligence in getting to the bottom of that.
This guy was an experienced marine explorer that claimed to have seen a plesiosaur and wasn't afraid to tell people about it.
Amazing.
Yeah, I mean, how can you ignore that quality of evidence?
Absolutely. Now, there's some pretty interesting conversations going on in the chat. I see you guys talking about it. I have to read this comment. I almost laughed when I first read it, but Uncle Junior responded, said, I tend to agree. A basking shark never had the makings of a varsity athlete. Thanks for the answer, good sirs. Obviously, that's a Sopranos joke. Great. Yeah. That brought a smile to my face. But there was a question from Jordan. Let's see if I can find it. So Jordan Warner, who actually, I believe, interviewed you back in the day. So he's great. I've been talking to him in the past couple of years now, and he's revamping his cryptid hunt show.
I believe he was 16 years old when he made that documentary.
Oh, he was like, I think he was in middle school or something, or high school.
Yeah.
But
we've known him for a long time.
Yeah, he's great. He's back at it. He's doing a lot of films now. But he has a question. Says, hey, Scott and Alex, great show as always. Thank you. How often are champ and other lake cryptids reported in swamp or marshlands? Is it common?
I would say no, because we just went over the land sightings.
Yeah.
And The 1991 case around Ferrisburg was supposedly it was coming out of a swamp, so I guess we want to include that one. Dennis Hall had this idea. You know, he had a lot of ideas. You know, he thought these creatures were Tanystropheus reptiles, much more amphibious creature apparently than what is generally assumed to be their behavior. But he had this idea that they went into marshes and swamps to hibernate during the winter. Now, he's been pushing this idea for 35 years and hasn't come up, to my knowledge, with any convincing evidence that that's the case. So, I'm highly skeptical.
Right.
And another thing you have to think about, too, is you have people that monitor the water quality of Lake Champlain and monitor the drinking water quality coming out of Lake Champlain. And where do they get their water samples? Back in the backwaters, in the swamps. So you would think if that was the case, something would have happened and we would have heard about it over the years. So, on balance, I'm going to say no. But what's to stop one from occasionally crawling up out of the water and going into a swamp? I can't see any reason why they wouldn't, but I would think it would be a very rare occasion. I wouldn't think it would be a regular behavior.
Right, and there's such an abundance of water in general in that area. There's plenty of places to go. But this is a really interesting one. Now, obviously, you were on MonsterQuest, as we talked about, so you were on the Champ episode. They did a lot of episodes, obviously, MonsterQuest, but Raptor Crazy asks, question for Scott, has he done any research for the gentleman in Florida that recorded sea creatures that was on an episode of MonsterQuest and the location was kept under wraps? Now, obviously, you live in Florida, and do you know...
I know about this. This is Gene Salowine.
Yeah, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
At a place called the Lake Worth Lagoon, which is over on the east coast of Florida. And I'm trying to think, there's a well-known town that is near the location in Florida. But it's one of those coastal towns. Anyway, this is a lagoon, and apparently all kinds of animals, it's brackish water, all kinds of animals pass through that lagoon. You've got manatees, you've got alligators that pass through there, you've got bull sharks.
Wow.
Yeah. So, anyway, looking at Salawine's videos, a lot of people are inclined to think that what he has filmed are simply manatees with mutilated tails.
From a
whose tails
propeller.
That have got their tails caught in boat propellers, and it's mutilated their tails into sections to give it that.
Does that happen?
Yes,
I've seen manatees in Florida, and is that a common occurrence?
Yes, absolutely. There's all kinds of photographs all over. You do a Google image of manatee with a mutilated tail, and you'll see what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And when the tails heal, they heal in weird ways. They don't look normal. And a lot of what you see, I believe, in Salawine's videos are those weird-looking mutilated tails flopping up around and going up and down. That's what has given people the idea that it's got a trident tail. It's actually, there's a photograph of a manatee's tail that's split into 3 sections. Just exactly like what you see on Salawine's video. Now, part of what's confusing this whole matter, I believe, there is one piece of video that Salowine shot that's clearly the head of an alligator swimming by. And I think part of what's happened here is that people have created a chimera out of a piece of video footage of a manatee with a mutilated tail, and they've seen that alligator-looking head and said, oh, no, it can't be a manatee, it's got a head like an alligator. Well, that's because he filmed an alligator.
Right.
Now, this is just my opinion. Other people have said, oh, we think it's a weird seal, or we think it's a mixture of manatees and seals, but honestly, I believe it's just manatees and known wildlife. But like I
Sure.
said, that's my opinion. I mean, I've been studying this stuff for years, and that's what I think. So
Yeah, no, that's really interesting.
yeah,
And Rock Kite Man says boaters going too fast in areas where manatees are present, and it's it's unfortunate that it happens, but
yeah,
something I wanted to ask you. We've talked about Champ a lot. You're living in Florida now. Obviously, Florida is a state that's surrounded by ocean. I mean, you have the Gulf of Mexico on one side, the Atlantic on the other side, lots of bodies of water within Florida, and then you have lots of aquatic creatures. Let's say whether they're alligators or
yeah.
invasive pythons,
Yeah,
manatees.
that's the other thing. You got giant snakes that aren't native to here that are apparently got breeding populations in South Florida.
Crazy.
Thank God they're not as far north as I am, but there's all kinds of weird things going on. There's feral iguanas all over parts of Florida. Herpes-infected monkeys living in the woods.
Oh my gosh, crazy
There's
stuff.
all kinds of weird things. Yeah.
So with that being said, I mean, obviously, on this show we talk a lot about Sasquatch and Bigfoot. Skunk ape is present in Florida, but are there any? I know the Pensacola serpent stories you've looked into. What other kind of, if you want to talk about that, and maybe some of the other Florida stuff that you've looked into?
One that I'm currently in the middle of investigating. We haven't physically gone over there yet, but I've been doing a lot of archival research ahead of the trip.
Sure.
We're going to a place called Lake Monroe, which is really just an enlargement of a part of the St. Johns River. Now, you've probably heard of what they call Pinky, the St. Johns River monster.
Right.
Okay, a lot of people have the impression, based on some of the cryptozoology literature, that this is some kind of weird salamander-like amphibian. Now that's one theory, but if you really look at the data, what is being described for the most part is one of your typical long-necked plesiosaur-looking creatures. Yeah, there's even an eyewitness sketch I found recently from a famous sighting at the mouth of the river in Jacksonville that looks for all the world like a long-necked plesiosaur with some kind of rabbit ear-looking snorkels on top of its head. This is very similar to some of the reports from Loch Ness with horns or snorkels. And there's one report from Lake Champlain from 1971 that has these snorkel-like horns. So we can't rule out that being a feature of Champ as well. It might be a sexually dimorphic feature. I don't know. But getting back to Lake Monroe, there were a series of very intriguing sightings between 1955 and 1961 in that Lake Monroe area. Directly north of that Lake Monroe is a place called Blue Springs, which is a hangout for manatees, and a little over there is a place called Astor, Florida.
I've actually been to the that area with the manatees. I swam with them. You can go in there and swim with the manatees. Amazing experience. It's incredible.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, anyway, you know the place I'm talking about then. Well, anyway, there were some very intriguing sightings in the mid-1950s to the early 1960s. One of them, these guys felt something raise their boat up and looked down and saw some kind of a weird creature allegedly walking along the bottom of the river, but they didn't describe it as being an alligator. Alligators do this all the time. Probably the most interesting one, guy said he saw a creature like a long-necked dinosaur come crawl up on the shore, eat plant material, and then go back in the water.
Wow.
Yeah, so he's describing some kind of a brontosaurus or plesiosaur-like creature crawling up on the land and eating plant material. And oddly enough, there's a weird sighting from Loch Ness from 1934 of an Nessie doing the same thing. So I don't know, you know. And then there's, from 1961, there's a sighting of this woman named Mary Lou Richardson, and her father and somebody else claimed to have seen, in their words, they described it as a donkey-sized dinosaur with a long neck.
Wow.
and a snake-like head. Now, this all happened in this one little area of Lake Monroe and Blue Springs and Astor. And I have some of the original newspaper articles from the 50s that I tracked down about all this.
Yeah, what's really interesting about that area is, from what I recall being in there, is, we were on paddle boards, right? And we're kind of going through, and you're in these wider sections of the water where it gets pretty deep. You can't even see the bottom. And there will be points where you'll just see this large object swimming under you, and it'll be a manatee. As you go into the actual springs, that's when the water is maybe only 6-7 feet deep, and it's crystal clear, so you can see straight Homosasta, all these areas you can see right into the water. But then the deeper parts, we were even warned by some of the guides there that said, watch out, there's like a gator or two that like to hang out there. They don't usually like to be in those areas, but you'll find one or two because it's fresh water there.
Well, you really up one of those.
It's funny, people in the chat are talking about eating gator, and gator's tasty, and it is. It's very good.
Yeah, especially the tail.
We just had some in Louisiana. We had some gator sausage in New Orleans when we were there doing our Rougarou episode with Chasing Legends, and we had gator bites is I think what a lot of people try, but you haven't tried a gator sausage. I gotta say it was pretty delicious. So
I don't think I've had that. I've had the tail cut up like a chop.
The tail has a lot of meat in it, but I don't know if they do the sausage in Florida. Obviously, in Louisiana they got the whole Cajun thing going
on sale in the grocery store. So
interesting.
Next time I go, I'll get some.
Yeah, it's definitely was tasty. At least the restaurant we had it in right in New Orleans.
Yeah, I mean, as the old saying goes, tastes like chicken.
Yeah. Well, it makes sense if the theory that chicken and reptiles are related.
The tail tastes almost like a greasy pork chop, sort of.
Right.
Very much like pork. Yeah.
It is interesting. It really is interesting just talking about all these different aquatic creatures and everything, and everything happening to be in Florida. Now, here's a Florida-related question again from our friend Corrado. He says, "How large exactly would you guess the Pensacola sea serpent is?"
Well, based on the eyewitness description, they said, or McCleary, the only living eyewitness, said that he saw a pole-like object standing 12 feet out of the water, which is assumed to have been the head and the neck. So, looking at that, you could say, well, maybe we're talking about something along the lines of 30 feet, which is not reasonable, depending on how long the neck is. If it had, some plesiosaurs, the elasmosaurs especially, were so strange they had necks that were twice the length of their body. So if you had a situation like that, it might have been smaller. It might have been 20 feet long, but with most of the length being the neck. I don't know, because we don't have a description of the body. He claimed to have seen something that looked like a flipper or a dorsal fin as it went into the water, so that would imply that it had some kind of appendages.
Right.
But really, all you've got to work with is a description of the neck and the head. Sure. But it was assumed that because that was so large and was standing so erect, that it must have had some kind of larger body to be able to raise the neck and the head up like that. So,
yeah, it's really interesting. Do you think, or have you noticed, which side of Florida tends to have more strange sightings, or is it the side by the Gulf or by the Atlantic?
Well, not really. It's the site. Let's say you stick to long necks.
Sure.
Which basically what we're talking about. There are a series of sighting of long necks up in the Panhandle, running from Pensacola over to Destin in a dune lake called Lake Powell. So this is running roughly, 100 miles of coastline up in the Panhandle.
Yep.
Then you go over to the east coast of Florida, to Jacksonville, and you've got the mouth of the St. Johns River, and that runs down through most of Florida. It actually flows north like Lake Champlain. It starts in central Florida and flows north. And you've got all these enlargements on the St. Johns. Besides Lake Monroe, you've got a famous bass fishing resort called Lake George, which is also an enlargement of the St. Johns, and it's north of Lake Monroe. And you've got sightings all up and down the St. Johns River, going from the mouth at Jacksonville all the way down to where it begins. So those are long necks right there. And then you've got a case, I don't know if you ever heard about this, the New River Inlet carcass. That was
I don't believe so, no.
Yeah. This was a carcass that was found around 1885, I believe.
Wow.
On the east coast of Florida, at the mouth of the Indian River. It's somewhere down, not quite to Miami, but in that stretch between where the Lake Worth Monster was filmed and Miami. So it's down on the southeast coast of Florida.
Gotcha.
And this carcass, from the description, sounds like one of these long-necked basking shark carcasses, or possibly a mutilated whale carcass, or possibly a dead plesiosaur, but whatever it was missing a head. So it had a large body with a long, thin neck and no head. And was fairly large. And apparently what happened to it is, after it was initially seen, it got washed out back to sea by a storm, one of these hurricanes. But there are drawings of it and eyewitness descriptions of it. So this could potentially be the body of one of these monsters we're talking about.
Right.
So
Now,
I wasn't there. But
is there anything, Florida related that you're working on? Are you working on anything about creatures in Florida?
Yeah. Unfortunately, my great friend, you may have known him, Scott Mardis, passed away. Great Florida cryptozoologist, very knowledgeable, and he'll really be missed. I'm looking into some of the things that he has investigated in the past with a filmmaker out of Tampa named Robbie Antilla. He has or had a podcast called Swamp Dog Chronicles. I don't know if you remember that. But he's been producing a lot of YouTube only documentaries about true crime and cryptozoology and the paranormal. And he decided he wanted to do a bunch of Florida lake monster stuff. And he also, we want to go up to Altamahaha for 2 days and do an investigation up there. And
that is a really interesting one.
I'm really excited about that. We've already been to a little lake called Lake Clinch, which had a history of sightings of some kind of giant snake. There was a guy that was drowned there in 1924, and there's some suspicion that he may have been drowned and killed by some kind of a large python.
Yeah.
So we went there for a day and did some filming, and he's got me interviewed talking about all that.
Awesome.
But supposedly sometime in the next couple of weeks or early next month, we're going to go to Lake Monroe, and then we're going to do a big 2-day trip up to the Altamahaha. I'm really excited about that because I've made one trip up there already. You've probably seen the pictures of me standing next to the statue.
Yeah, that's really an awesome piece of.
Yeah, we were just passing through on our way to Vermont and stopped by because we wanted to see it, But
that's
this will actually be a real investigation, hopefully.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, people think of lake monsters and typically these northern lakes, right? We're thinking Loch Ness, Lake Champlain, Okanagan. Yeah. That's usually where a lot of people describe lake monsters. But the South Florida has a lot of these lake/river/ocean kind of sea serpent type things. And do you think they're all related to this kind of plesiosaur thing, or what do you think there's different things going on?
If you look at the fossil record of plesiosaurs, there was a lot of biodiversity. You had ones that lived in warm climates, and then you had ones that lived in cold climates with water with sea ice in it. And you had freshwater ones, and then you had evidence of ones that came from the ocean and swam up rivers, and then would go back out.
Wow.
So they were obviously, they were like saltwater crocodiles and bull sharks. They had the ability to flip their metabolism to live in either salt or fresh water. Their osmoregulation, you know. So, you know, you can look at the biodiversity of the different types of plesiosaurs from the fossil record and see exactly what you're talking about today. That doesn't mean these monsters are necessarily plesiosaurs, but it's telling you that they were all, you know, plesiosaur wasn't just one type of reptile, it was a whole order of reptiles. And there was a lot of biodiversity, different neck lengths, different head sizes, different diets, different body shapes. About all they had in common was that they swam through the water with 4 flippers. Beyond that, there was all kinds of biodiversity. So,
yeah,
you know,
and
they're constantly learning new things about them. Recently, there was a paper published that described the fact that some of them had horizontal tail fins like a dolphin. Now, most of the reptiles that we know of from the fossil record that did have tail fins, like the ichthyosaur, had vertical tail fins like a shark. But no, now they're saying that plesiosaurs, at least some of them, had horizontal tail fins that went from side to side like a dolphin. So that would seem to imply that they're moving in conjunction with their flippers in the vertical plane, like a cetacean.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I don't know. You know, there's a lot of speculation. It's too early to say for sure right now. You got to think, a lot of these animals, you know, all we know about them is their skeleton and small traces of organs and things like that. You know, we may never figure out how they lived.
Right.
Completely. You know, we can speculate, but we may never actually know unless we find one alive, which I'm hoping we do. But
right. Now, two questions as we're sort of wrapping up here. First is my last 2 questions rather. What do you make of the recent Loch Ness sonar readings? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, you know, very impressed. Sure. You know, I mean, I look at the equipment that was used, and I see images very similar to what me and Will got, because we were using very similar equipment. You know, it's got the same colors and setup and everything. So, yeah, I'm very impressed with it. And, you know, there's a long history of anomalous sonar contacts at Loch Ness going back to, I think it was 1953, somewhere in there. So, you know, this has been going on for ages. And even Adrian Shine, you know what a skeptic he is, he's got some sonar contacts from Operation Deep Scan that 30 years later he hasn't explained away. He can't explain them away, so they're unexplained. So all this means is that we have proven that there are unexplained objects moving around in Loch Ness that we don't know what they are.
Yeah.
Which is significant, but, you know, we can't prove that they're animals yet. So
Sure.
I can't prove that the sonar contact that me and Will got was not a piece of wood debris or bubbles or some kind of a, you know, weird bottom echo that bounced up to look like something else. I don't know. But the thing is, neither does anyone else.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I've shown the sonar contact to people that are experts in sonar, and they haven't explained it away yet. So I've made the effort. So, you know, the only thing that's ever going to solve this is the type specimen.
Yeah.
A piece of a champ or a bone or a skin sample, something biological that is unique, that is not a known animal. Then we can say, okay, here you go. The Lake Champlain monster is real, and here's a piece of it. That's the only thing that's ever going to sell this. So.
Yeah, and my last question, it's regarding Champ, so that's a perfect segue.
Yeah.
Every few years, you know, it seems that obviously activity is most active in the summer and these times of period, you know, when it's warmer out in the lake. There's a few sightings, you know, maybe a photo or two that come out. it seems like, at least to me, this summer, there seemed to be more either sightings or claims of photos and video evidence. I mean, when I was there in September, we interviewed a lady who had claimed to have seen a head and a neck in August, and there was a sighting 2 days before we showed up to the lake. You know, unfortunately, didn't get to interview the guy. He left right before we showed up.
I know it.
So what do you make of the fact that there were more sightings this year? Do you attribute that to anything, or what are your thoughts?
Well, you know, people ask me, are there any hot spots? Sightings are all over the lake. I was able to find even 4 up in Missisquoi Bay in Canada.
Which is a very shallow area.
Spread out over a period of like 70, 80 years. You know, one from 1880 and the next one's from 1950.
Wow.
We don't know enough about these animals to know if they move in family groups or if they hang around one area for a few months and then move on or what. We just don't know enough yet. I could buy the idea that there might be a hot spot for a small period of time in one area.
Sure.
Which would seem to imply there's a small group of these things hanging around one place for whatever reason for a small period of time, then they move on. But they're literally seen from Whitehall all the way up to Rouse's Point and up into Canada.
So that's 120 something miles.
I mean, you know, look at where the photographs have come from. You got Sandra Manzi's photograph was somewhere up around St. Albans or the Albert Passage, which is the north part of the lake.
Yeah.
Then you go all the way to the other side of the New York side, south to the All Sable River, where the Bodette video happened. And then the Elson videos all the way down in Burlington at Oak Ledge Park. I mean, these are widely spaced parts of the lake on different sides of the lake.
And then you have a place like Fort Henry, which is even further down.
I mean, I'm not saying there's not a lot of sightings around Fort Henry, but that's not the only place Champ is seen.
Yeah, which is really interesting. And when I was there in September, what really surprised me was, you know, a lot of time I've spent has been around, you know, the middle section of the lake, Burlington, south of Burlington, Fort Henry. I haven't spent as much time up near the islands and St. Albans Bay.
Yeah.
So when we were in St. Albans Bay to interview this lady who had the sighting, her husband said that there's just sightings all over the place in that community over the years.
Yeah, I've got old newspaper articles from the 1800s from St. Albans.
Yeah, and what was so interesting was when he said that his wife talked about her sighting, all of a sudden there were relatives and people that they knew that said, well, hey, in the 70s, I experienced this in the same area. I just never really talked to people about it. And there was all these new sightings that were kind of coming out, which is just amazing. I mean, to think about, you know, these...
see things, and they're hesitant to talk about it because they don't want to be embarrassed. But then somebody else that they know sees something, and they may be more comfortable talking about it under those circumstances.
Yeah. It is just interesting. I mean, if you had to put a rough estimate, just kind of last question here, what would you put the amount of Champ sightings, I mean, including basically anything someone's claimed as Champ, where would you put that sighting? How many sightings are we talking about?
Well, you know, some of these sightings are buried in obscure newspapers. You can't get access to them. You don't even know they're there.
Yeah.
You know, so I've estimated over the years there's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 250 to 300 sightings going from 1873 up to the modern era, roughly. And there is, you know, I don't know if you know about this, but Robert Bartholomew found an article from some kind of little New York newspaper from 1808.
Ah, yeah.
One sentence, it says, a monster has lately been seen in Lake Champlain, and that's all it says. You know, what are you supposed to read into that? I don't know, but...
Well, it's just interesting that Champ had sort of a heyday before even Loch Ness was known about.
Well, yeah, there was a lot of weird things. I mean, there was a French-Canadian missionary that lived up in Quebec, Father Louis Nicolas, from France, lived up in Quebec, ministered to the Indians between 1664 and 1675. He goes back to France and writes a book called the Codex Canadensis around 1700. In his book, he's got this thing called the river horse of the St. Lawrence River, and it looks like Basilosaurus. Got a whale's body with a whale's tail, a set of front appendages, and a horse head. And it's clearly not a distorted version of a beluga or a sturgeon, because both of those also appear in the book, and they look basically like sturgeons and belugas. So I don't know what to make of this, but that's very close to Lake Champlain. You know, the St. Lawrence connects to the Richelieu River, which runs down into the northern part of Lake Champlain. So that may be significant too.
It is quite a body of water, and
you've got these weird petroglyphs, which you had in your documentary. You know, the Abenaki petroglyphs and the one up at Mount Pinnacle.
So I actually have the poster for that here in the back today, as opposed to the usual Lines of the East. But this is the poster that was done by Steve Bissett, who did the Swamp Thing, a Vermont native. He was in the documentary as well. Fun fact, he actually based this off of the poster art for The Legend of Boggy Creek. So those that know that, this is the same sort of style, as you can see, with the champ.
Is that the one I signed?
Yeah, this is the one that you signed, and that unfortunately, everyone who was in it except for Bill Dranginis.
Oh, I thought you got to sign it. Well, that's too bad.
I sent him it, and unfortunately he passed away, and his daughter sent me it a couple months after she had dug it up. But, you know, I tried, but, you know, everyone else that was in there basically is on the poster, and I really enjoyed that. That was obviously great. If you guys want to watch that, that's on Small Town Monsters.
I miss Will. Something terrible.
He was a great researcher with Bigfoot, especially. I mean, that's how I first learned about him, was with Bigfoot. But no, it was interesting. That's obviously was my kind of first introduction to Champ, and I've been hooked ever since. Obviously, we're doing stuff with the Lake Champlain Zoological Inquiry. Hopefully, this coming summer we'll be able to do some drone work and some other stuff on the lake.
Here's where I'm at with that. If we get more stimulus money, I'm buying some hydrophones and an aluminum boat. I'm waiting for that money to get here.
Oh, that'd be great.
Yes. And one thing we seriously have to think about is this COVID quarantine restrictions still going to be in effect by next summer. Hopefully it won't be.
Right.
But if it is, you see, the plan that I was working on was the idea of us hopping around the lake and camping at various campsites and staying, say, a couple of days here at one campsite and then bouncing over here and doing the work we want to do. And we're not having to pay a lot for this overhead. We're staying in tents. And
sure.
You know,
another option is staying on some islands. So we were actually supposed to do that with Chasing Legends. You know, one of the guys I know there now at the lake has some great contacts who own some of those islands.
Yeah.
And they'd said, you know, if it weren't for COVID, they would have allowed us to, you know, actually camp out on the island. Everyone's kind of nervous.
If this COVID quarantine is still in effect by next summer, that's going to put a kibosh on all this bouncing around to different campsites.
Right.
So I'm thinking we might just skip a year and go the next year, if that is the situation. Hopefully it won't be. But
well, we'll have to see how the situation is.
My idea is to start planning sometime in January. At least us all sit down and talk with each other and throw ideas around. You know, get a run and go at it. I usually do anyway. You know.
Definitely.
So we'll see.
We'll have to see. You know, everything's an unknown at this point. So we'll
hopefully. I always go. You know.
Yeah, of course. No, it's and I always say that Lake Champlain is one of my favorite places. It's really an amazing body of water. There's nowhere like it. It's just a pretty unique and interesting area. And you know, we talked a little bit about the lowering water levels and the pollution. Just hopefully that doesn't do irreparable damage to.
Well, you know, if the lake is dying, it's urgent for us to hurry up and get cracking on this and try to do what we're going to do before it gets any worse. You know.
Yeah, I can't imagine not having that place to go to. I mean, I live about 3 hours away from it, and I just can't imagine it not being there, which is it's
a beautiful place. It always has been. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, Scott, I thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us tonight, and and as I said, I don't hesitate to say you are a treasure trove of knowledge regarding not just Champ. Obviously, I think Champ is probably, anything you need to know about Champ, talk to Scott Mardis. But all these other lake aquatic cryptids, Florida stuff, Scott is clearly on the beat with a lot of that stuff. And I know this isn't what we usually talk about on the show, but I think it's interesting nonetheless to talk about all sorts of topics, lake monsters, cryptids. It's all in there, and it's all really fascinating and interests me. So, again, thank you, Scott, and wishing you luck with future projects in the Florida series. And thank you guys, everyone.
You'll be hearing about it. So,
oh, absolutely, I'm excited. So yeah, thank you, everyone, as always in the comments. Everyone sounds like they're having a good time. Great questions as always. Appreciate that. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, next week's show will be Doug Hajicek, who is the producer and creator of MonsterQuest, which Scott was in on the Champlain episode. I've got to have so many questions for him. We'll talk about Champ, Snail Grove Lake, all kinds of stuff. That show was obviously a big influence in cryptozoology. One of the last really, in the vein of in search of, or
it was a good quality show.
It was really well done.
Coming out these days too.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
So it'll be interesting to talk to Doug and get some great questions for next week, guys. So anyone else has questions, obviously bring them, but it'll be an interesting show. And then going forward, definitely got some interesting shows coming up. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the show as well, check out previous shows. Feel free to subscribe, share this kind of content. If you guys like this, please help support the channel. Just like and hit the bell icon to let you know when there's a new stream coming up or a new video coming up. I will be putting out some non-live stream videos as well, more Bigfoot related stuff soon. So just want to thank everyone again. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, Alex.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure. All right, guys, everyone have a great rest of your week, and we will see you all next Monday. So take it easy, guys. Have a good one. Stay safe, everybody.